Did black people get their culture from white people? Stay tuned to find out more. So before I begin, me and Thomas Sowell need to provide a disclaimer for you. Thomas Sowell says, to prevent the words in this essay that follow from being stretched, twisted, or given clever meanings, let me state here and now that these essays do not mean that all Southern whites were or are rednecks, that all black Americans today or in the past were or are black rednecks, or that slavery is somehow morally acceptable because everyone was guilty of it. We understand that black people are not a monolith and we cannot put them in a box, so don't get mad. And when I talk about black people in this video, I'm talking about specifically the poor black inner city community, not black people as a whole. Now, who are these white people that supposedly gave black people their culture? This redneck culture comes from the British Isles, mostly from the Scottish and English immigrants to America. And these people, the Scots and the English, warred each other for centuries, and in the 16th and 17th century, these settlers forced the Irish into indentured servitude, which is basically just a step above slavery. And then they immigrated to America. And this redneck culture from the British Isles ended up dying out in the British Isles while remaining in the South amongst the poor whites and eventually the black people that lived in the South as well. Thomas Sowell says that it's not uncommon for a culture to die out in its origin and continue on where it's been transplanted. So let's start off at the beginning of the book. It starts off with, these people are creating a terrible problem in our cities. They can't or won't hold a job. They flout the law constantly and neglect their children. They drink too much, and their moral standards would shame an alley cat. For some reason or other, they absolutely refuse to accommodate themselves to any kind of decent, civilized life. This was said in 1956 in Indianapolis, not about blacks or other minorities, but about poor whites from the South. So what is the redneck culture? These are some of their cultural values and social patterns. Aversion to work, drunkenness, lack of entrepreneurship, reckless searches for excitement, lively music and dance, touchy pride, vanity, boastfulness. These were all a part of the redneck culture. The redneck culture died out amongst most black and white Southerners while surviving today in the poorest black ghettos. This Southern redneck culture was not prevalent amongst all whites in the South at the time. There's a man named Frederick Law Olmsted, and it says, in his journey to the South, when he found well-run businesses, they were run by Northerners, foreigners, or Jews. When you find a well-run plantation, it was likely ran by Northerners. Olmsted says their destitution, referring to the white Southerners, is not material only. It is intellectual and it is moral. So these are people who lacked any kind of morals. It was quite common to see them killing others just on the streets. Thomas Sowell says, on both sides of the Atlantic, pride and violence were popular among these Euro settlers. Many incredibly violent killings and maimings occurred. And he says that the interesting part isn't the isolated killings themselves, but the social attitudes around such incidents that allowed these incidents to occur, because the killers knew that they could get away with it and the community would mostly support them. Thomas Sowell says that most duels occurred over non-substantive issues, but over words considered insulting. And this pattern continues on in the black community today. Dinesh D'Souza in 1995 had an essay where he says, half of all murder victims in America were black, 94% killed by other blacks. Reasons for many gang members who say, cause he look at me funny, cause he give me no respect, and other reasons reminiscent of the touchy pride and hair trigger violence of rednecks and crackers in an earlier era. So what does cracker mean? I've heard people say that cracker meant when a slave master cracks his whip, and this is where the term cracker comes from, but this doesn't seem to be the case. Thomas Sowell says that it actually comes from the term wisecracker, or one who talks trash, because that's what the Southern whites did. They talked trash and they bragged all the time. Southern whites were described as boasters and threateners, and people didn't love the Southern whites just because they were white. A 1951 survey in Detroit found that white Southerners living there were considered undesirable by 21% of those surveyed, compared to 13% who ranked blacks the same way. These white Southerners had a lack of industriousness and entrepreneurship. They were described as too poor to keep slaves and too proud to work. And this can be seen by their economic activity. They had most of the cows in the South at the time in America, while producing a very small amount of butter and other dairy products compared to Northerners, simply because they were too lazy and ignorant to learn how to make it. These were not smart people either, because they were not interested in education. An 1800 study showed that half of South whites could not sign their name. In 1850, 1/5 of South whites were illiterate, compared to only 1% of New Englanders. By World War I, white Southern soldiers scored lower on mental tests than their Northern black soldier counterparts. Here's another telling difference between Northerners and Southerners. It was considered a hanging offense in New England, while in the South, it was often less severely punished than petty theft. Let's talk about some of the very close similarities between modern black culture, or the black redneck culture, and the old Southern redneck culture. There's a card game named Whist that is majoritively played by black people, and this actually began in the 18th century in the British upper class. This game does not exist in Africa. Poor black culture today adopted Ebonics hypersexualization, disinterest in education, and violence from the British islands. And let's talk about Ebonics, or Black English as some people call it. Ebonics comes from Southern whites. These speech patterns died out in Britain while surviving in the American South. This language had been spoken throughout the South and the west of England through the 17th century. So here's a list of verbiage. Where a Northerner said, I am, you are, she isn't, it doesn't, and I haven't, a Southerner of even high rank preferred to say, I be, you be, she ain't, it don't, I ain't. From these same regions of England came such words as yeller for yellow, axe for ask, acrost for across, y'all for you, bile for boil, dough for door, dis for this, and dat for that. Chitterlings, or what is commonly known in the black community as chitlins for hog entrails, continued to be used in some localities in England, even in the 20th century, but no such words came from Africa. Another interesting point, they had a lot of similarities in religion. There was a lot of yelling in church and a lot of repeating of phrases. The preacher would yell so much that at times he would have to sit down and catch his breath. Thomas Sowell says they did not observe the Sabbath as it was intended. They work, run, swear, and drink here on Sundays just as they do on any other day of the week. They often got drunk on Saturday night and were often in no condition to attend church Sunday morning. And these cultural traits followed black people out of the southern countryside and into urban ghettos. This redneck culture has affected higher proportions of the black population than the white population, because only 1/3 of all whites in America at the time in the antebellum South were living in the South at that time, while 9/10 of all black people in America lived in the South up until the late 1800s, early 1900s. So these cultural patterns of Southern rednecks became that of Southern blacks, more so than survivals of African culture, because they had not been in contact with Africa for many centuries at this point. Even in colonial times, most blacks on American soil had been born there. And I think it's pretty common knowledge that Africans and American black people hate each other. And there's a reason for that. Their cultures are so different. So how did white Southerners and a lot of black people in America escape this redneck culture? Thomas Sowell says that education was explicit in replacing the Southern culture with the Northern culture. He says that many children, including blacks, were taught to speak correctly. They were expected to be courteous, speak softly, and were explicitly taught to not exhibit the boisterousness of ordinary Negroes. I did say Thomas Sowell says that before that, so that's not my words, okay? And I could even see this today myself. I remember when I was in school, the teachers used to say, ain't a word. But there were many different ways that this redneck culture eroded over time. We can even see this in slavery. The house slaves were treated differently than the field slaves. Mixed people, or what was referred to as mulattoes, were treated differently and even allowed in white neighborhoods at the time in the 1800s. But it wasn't because they were lighter skinned. It was because they had a different culture than the Southern redneck culture. They adopted the Northern culture, which was more polite, more courteous, wasn't loud or boisterous or bragful, and didn't have a hair-triggered temper. But then in the late 1800s to early 1900s, Southern blacks, those 9/10 of Southern blacks in America, started to move to northern areas, and it was because of this culture, actually, that they began segregation again in these northern cities where blacks were actually, for a while, allowed to live in these northern cities. And then they were pushed into the urban ghettos, and black people have moved back south, up north, all around ever since then. So this black culture mostly survives today in the poorest urban ghettos. So this emigration by Southern blacks resulted in great retrogressions when they carried over their redneck culture to the north. Southern blacks in the North had a 5-time rate of crime over blacks born in Pennsylvania. In Washington, births out of wedlock doubled. But then things got a little bit better around the 30s, 40s, and even 50s. The murder rates prior to the 1960s were declining among blacks and shot up in the 60s. And for a period, I believe in the 40s, black people had higher marriage rates, lower divorce than white people at the time. And in the 40s, there were higher rates of high educated, high status jobs amongst black people than in the 60s. So what happened in the 60s for this stagnation and regression once again? Although they signed the Civil Rights Act in 64 and Voting Rights Act in 65, which gave more freedom and more elected officials, some of these effects on black people include the welfare state, and this enabled the black people to avoid consequences of the redneck culture. Lax law enforcement enabled violent crime. Non-judgmental trends enable escape of moral condemnation. And people still today believe that a non-redneck black person is considered white. This causes stereotypes to flourish and manifest. Some black people are now too scared to do schoolwork in an effort to not look white, or not dress nice to not look white, or not speak correctly so that they don't appear white. So that's where the white liberals come in. Thomas Sowell says that when white couples who adopt black children are told to remember to put their black children in touch with their cultural heritage, all too often this means the redneck culture. However much the achievement of black individuals is celebrated, the culture behind that achievement is not. Today, the culture that is celebrated is not the one that succeeded, but the one that failed, the black redneck culture. So that's black rednecks and white liberals, and that is actually only chapter 1. There is 6 chapters on different topics, and I'll probably do some videos on those. Here they are right here. Those are the different chapters. I'll probably do one on the Jews next, and it's actually in defense of Jews. So sorry YouTube, can't shut down my channel today. So yeah, let me know if you want some more chapters in this book. I'll make some videos on them. Like, comment, and subscribe, please.